I've found to hate Teams during this pandemic, they're legion.
Right. Okay, welcome to Cloud Data Driven Online User Group Meeting. Our agenda for today's meeting is the Cloud Awakens Azure SQL Server for the on-premises DBA. The rules are you guys are welcome to comment, but with respect. There must be no offensive comments. I have everybody videos and microphone turn off. At the end of the session, I will enable these options so this way you guys can unmute yourself and ask questions if you guys have any. Right? Feel free to follow us on social media at Cloud Data Driven. We have Alexander is our speaker, right? And then, yes, he's a community builder, Microsoft certified trainer. He's a speaker, and also he's working as a principal solution architect. Alexander will introduce himself and provide you guys more details about his work experience. So we do have a couple other presentations lined up. You guys feel free to go and enjoy them. And then I think we have tons of them. So you guys can go and just enjoy and reserve your spot for them. If you guys want to present any session, feel free to email me at jjoseph@bigdatadriven.org. From now, I'm gonna pass Alexander the floor. Feel free to share your screen and start with the presentation. Thank you so much, Alexander, and it is an honor to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. One order just first. I see a hand from Linda. A hand up in the in Teams. Do you see that as well? I think she might want to say something.
Do you want me to unmute everyone?
Yeah,
now?
just to make sure that everything is good to go.
Perfect. Give me 1 second. You guys can unmute yourself. Feel free to do that if you have any questions.
Yes, this is Linda, and I do have a question because I do not see a chat available.
I disabled. So would you mind if you have a question to unmute yourself? And
that's fine. I just wanted to make sure there was some way to ask questions. Thank you.
Okay.
Awesome. Good catch, because then it's not just me that can't see the chat, because Teams have been known to throw these curveballs previously. And well, okay, yeah. So when the session is pretty much done, I invite you all to ask questions. Please hold your questions until I'm done, because otherwise my timing will just go out the window. All right, I will now make my offers to the Teams gods and share a screen, hopefully the screen. I think that is the screen. And yes, it is. Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for attending this session. This session, as you might infer from this logo, it might just have a small connection to Star Wars, just a small one. So if you're a Star Trek fan, I'm pretty sure that everyone can get along, because I mean, there's no if or else. I'm a Star Trek fan as well. So let's dive straight into it, because it is a time of conflict. The on-prem DBAs are under constant threat, and the cloud is encroaching on the last bastions of on-premises data. The DBAs are forced to consider moving their workloads to the cloud, and in a bold attempt to thwart the discussions, they offer compromise, putting databases on virtual machines in Azure. This desperate gamble did not pay off because management wants more, much more. The DBAs, while desperate for stability, for security, for performance, find themselves fighting a battle for survival. Will the DBAs have a place in the new era of the cloud? This session begins with an overview of Azure and where SQL Server fits in among the other services of the cloud. And it follows with the key differences between the Azure SQL Server offerings. I'm going to introduce to you how to move data to the cloud, as well as talk a bit about some pros and cons and challenges of putting a database in the cloud in the first place. So let's start with the elephant in the room. A virtual machine with SQL Server in the cloud is a stopgap solution. It is not the end game. Absolutely not. And why? Because a VM in the cloud it's basically the same thing as running a VM on your own network. You're not really gaining anything from doing that. Sure, you're going to have automatic patching for the operating system and SQL Server. You're going to have some high availability solutions available to you, but at the end of the day, these are minor compared to the vast offerings that the service gives you. Now, there are some specific needs where a VM might be a good choice, and we're going to cover those as well. But the real power of of Azure is the service. All right. My name is Alexander. I have 23 years in IT, pretty much all of it spent with data, databases, and infrastructure in some way, shape, or form. These days, I work for a company called Solution Experts in Sweden as a principal solution architect, which, by the way, is the best title I've ever had because nobody have a clue what I do. But that's pretty easy to explain. I make data matter because only data that matters can inspire any change. And I do this by, well, I used to do this by going all over the world, speaking at conferences, teaching courses, and doing consulting. But since the world ended in March last year, so more than a year ago, I've been pretty much confined to my home office. And that is a nice home office, but I am sick and tired of these four walls. The cats are super happy that I haven't basically left my apartment for a year, but yeah, my wife is not. I am one of 7 data platform MVPs in Sweden. I co-host a podcast called Knee Deep in Tech, and that is the Doom logo for those of you who are in my age or older. And yes, I might be just a bit of a Star Wars fan, just a bit. And I want to start with also thanking Marietta Ivanova, a friend of mine in Finland, who has done all the artwork for this session. Right, so management and people in general are extolling the amazing things about the cloud. The trouble is they are sprouting useless words. So let's try to turn the words into a meaning, because we're hearing words like flexible. Well, I'm flexible-ish, yes, but in this case, flexible means that we can create and tear down something very, very quickly. So if I have an idea, I can whip something up and work with it and just tear it down again way, way faster than I can do on-prem. It's also scalable, and scalable in this case means that I can get more power on demand, and also that the sizing, if I need more power, that should be automatic. I don't need to go in and crank a knob or something. That's old school. This is also technically doable on-prem, especially if you're running a kind of a hyper-converged environment, but it's designed for this in the cloud. This is a kind of a contentious one, secure. Security has a lot of meanings, and in this specific case, I'm looking at data loss and leaking data and compliance. I vividly remember someone, well, I was working at the local university, and my boss had installed this fantastic, super powerful, basically steel door to the data center. And he said, well, nothing can get through this. We are now much more secure. I smiled and said, yes, you're technically correct. That door is going to hold off an army. But the problem is 10 inches to your left is a drywall. I can punch through that drywall and make a hole the size of me in 15 minutes. So it doesn't matter if the door is there. I'll just go by it instead of go through it. And this is where the cloud comes into its own. In many ways, the cloud is way more secure because it was built with compliance in, well, for starters. Automation. It should be able to take care of repetitive stuff. Well, you know, like performance tuning, high availability, and index rebuilds. And, oh yeah, and why not backups as well? Sure, it can do these things. And I can basically hear all of you screaming that you can't automate away the DBA. Well, no, you can't. But hold that thought, because we're going to have a conversation about this. When it comes to backups, same thing there. You can automate it, but be careful. And of course, we want to do integration. Now, this is where the cloud really comes into its own, into its own is what I'm trying to say. Because having a database on its own is usually, well, useless, I can say. Because a database has no point in being in and of its own. It needs to support some kind of business function. And well, integration makes that possible. And integrating stuff inside of Azure with security, with data transformations, all that stuff is dead easy. Probably way easier than doing it on-prem. Now, I think you're going to see a pattern here, because everything we're doing in the cloud can be done on-prem. I mean, it's technically the same thing, but some things are way easier in the cloud and some things are cheaper in the cloud. Now, a lot of things are going to be much more expensive in the cloud and more cumbersome as well. So it's all about finding a balance and basically picking your battles. So does this mean that the DBA, again, is going to be out of a job in 2 years? Well, I started working in 1997, and Anders started working even earlier than I did. And we've heard this forever. We've heard this every year that, yep, come next year and come whatever, you're going to be out of a job because the DBA doesn't need to exist anymore. I'm still here. Anders is still here. We're going to be here in 15 years' time. We're going to be here in 30 years' time, because you can automate a lot, but you cannot at the moment automate intuition. So what you can do is take away all the crap work, the menial work that we do every day. I mean, if we take a look at what a DBA does, these are common administration tasks. We create instances, we troubleshoot issues, we upgrade databases, we do capacity planning, we run index maintenance, we migrate databases. These are fairly menial tasks. They're not simple, but they're fairly menial. And if you just take away all the fluff, why are we here as DBAs? Again, a database does not have any reason for being in and of its own. We are here to serve the business. So at the end of the day, what we do is this, pretty much. We want to do proactive work. We want to review code. We want to improve code, anything to improve the business outcomes. That's why we're there. That's why we're paid top dollar. Well, not if you're in Sweden, you're not paid top dollar. Not that I'm bitter. Anyways, so we just try to figure out a way to make the fairly expensive people, DBAs are not that cheap. We want to have the most bang for our buck. So instead of having them creating databases all day, we want to have them focusing on the special stuff, the things that only they know. Unfortunately, this is not reality, because reality tends to look something like this. We spend the majority of time on menial tasks, things that could be automated. Just one word for you, Dba tools. It is a fantastic PowerShell tool that can take away a lot of your boring stuff. So we basically want to turn this on its head and make the repetitive tasks the small bar and the useful tasks the big bar. How do we go about and do that in the cloud? I'm very happy you asked. So what can we conclude? Well, it's the same skills. Anybody who comes to you and says, well, the cloud, dude, everything you learned the last 30 years is obsolete. You can just chuck it. Now it's the cloud. The cloud is the best thing that's happened since sliced spread, and you are now irrelevant. I'm going to go ahead and say, yeah, no, get out. Because it's the same skills. It is still a database. It is still data. It is still the same technical aspects. And even more importantly, it is still the same people. Tech is not that hard. People are hard. And trust me, regardless if we put the stuff in the cloud, the people are still going to be here. So it is the same skills. Don't run away and get new skills, because you can apply everything you already know. So that's a good way to start calming the on-prem DBA that is scared for their job. And we're going to do the same things. Everything we did on-prem, we're going to do in the cloud. But as you can see within the parentheses, we want to do the useful stuff. We want to try to avoid the boring stuff. And in many ways, this is automated for us, which we're gonna see in a bit. And of course, we're going to see the same challenges. Databases still break. People still manage to drop tables. People still manage to screw up the data. Don't get me started on quality. So from a business perspective, it is the same thing. We have just moved the storage medium of the data to the cloud. And as a DBA, well, yeah, instead of having to enjoy sitting in the data center with fans going off around me, I can now sit in my comfortable office and work on through a browser. But everything comes with a twist. Everything is subtly different. It is not entirely different, but it's subtly different. And I can warn you, assumption is the mother of all fuck-ups. Because if you come into the cloud with the assumption that everything you learned on-prem is directly applicable, you are going to have some issues. And the prime issue you're going to be facing is money. Everything in the cloud costs. And if you take away nothing from this session, take that. Everything in the cloud costs, and everything that you do in the cloud has consequences. Meaning that if I were to tune something on-prem, people will be happy. If I were to tune something in the cloud, I will have instant savings. But again, more about that later. So in essence, it's all about staying relevant. Just like you can't just sit on your posterior and think that whatever skills you have are going to serve you well until pension. Well, unless you're a COBOL programmer, that is probably going to be true. But we spend our lives learning. That's basically why we're here. That's why we're doing the work we're doing. I have yet to find the DBA, the successful DBA, I should say, or the successful anyone who does not spend an inordinate amount of time learning. Gone are the days of our parents and their parents when you learned a trade and you did that forever. My parents-in-law are, or they used to be doctors. They're retired now. But one of their main issues at the end of their careers were that medicine did not keep up, because people learned how to do a procedure back in med school, and then they basically did the same procedure forever. And things change. We get new information in tech every day, and I can guarantee you that everything changes in medicine as well, but it is so rooted in the medical profession that everything is already known. So there's no point in always learning. And I think that is a bit of an issue. So again, it's all about staying relevant. And this also means that you have a fantastic opportunity, because there is no shortage of people coming in to the tech world these days. And well, I'm 43 years old. Apparently, I am considered old, to which I have a lot of opinions, but that's a whole different story. But there's so many 20-somethings coming in to the tech world today, and being older, being more experienced is, in my view, it's a huge benefit, as long as you can explain why your skills acquired on SQL Server 6.5 are still relevant to SQL Server in Azure, which they are. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to basically do, well, this. We want to change off so the repetitive tasks, the boring crap, gets smaller and the useful tasks go up. So let's unpack this and see what are the different words really meaning. Let's start with flexible. All right. We're not going to be touching on VMs, because VMs are not the Azure SQL Server. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions, but I'm not going to be saying very much about VMs, apart from the fact that they are specialized. And if you can avoid them, do so. So we're going to start with Azure SQL Server. We have a number of things inside of that offering. A friend of mine is doing his first speaking engagement in about a week, and his session is called the On-Prem Data Warehouse Admin's First Trembling Steps in Azure. And it was kind of interesting to see him approach the concept of Azure, because his idea was, I'm just going to take a database and put it into Azure. How hard can it be? And as I told you, assumption is the mother of all fuck-ups. The first thing he tried to do was to restore a database. You can't. It doesn't work that way. And even before he got there, he scratched his head. Why are all these things? What's a managed instance? What's an Azure SQL Server? What's a MongoDB? What's a Cosmos DB? God. And yes, I said, calm down, because you have some reading to do. So for starters, the Azure SQL Server, it comes in two primary functions, if you will. Either you have the serverless or the provisioned one. The serverless is a really, really, really cool tool, which means that you're billed by the second. If you're not using the Azure SQL Server for at least an hour, it's going to basically go to bed, and you're not incurring any cost at all. So for these start-stop scenarios, it's a fantastic tool. And these days it can scale pretty big. So you're no longer bound to just 2 or 4 CPUs. So that's a really, really interesting way of doing things. And in my view, I think the serverless way is the way to go. Now, don't get fooled by serverless. Serverless just means that there's a crap ton of servers that somebody else manages. You still need to create an Azure SQL Server, and you still need to create a database on that server. But the database service handles it as a serverless, i.e. a start-stop database. You confused yet? Yeah, it's going to get worse. One other cool thing with this is that you can actually have it set to a half CPU. That's not going to be expensive, and it's not going to be very fast either. But if you just need some kind of table storage that you can't do with a normal Azure table storage, SQL Server is your guy. So the provision tier, it gets divided into a few parts as well. We have the managed instance, which is exactly what it says on the tin. It is a managed instance with everything that entails. You have the instance, you have databases inside of the instance, you have an agent, and then you have Azure SQL Server, which is, or I should say Azure SQL Database, which is one database and one database only. That is a super important distinction. While you have the instance, you can talk between the databases all you want. If you put something in the database, you can't. One of the biggest blockers for running stuff in Azure SQL Database is the simple fact that you cannot do cross-database scripting. Doesn't work that way. Oh, and there is no such thing as an agent either. That tends to get people screaming. There are ways around that, of course, but yeah. And we also have this guy, the Elastic Pool. It's all about bunching a number of databases together and have them work as a pool. I'm going to come back to that in a bit. Because first, we need to talk about DTUs or cores. So there's something called the DTU, or the Database Throughput Unit. The idea was that you have a pre-configured scalability. So you just go from 5 DTUs all the way up to 4,000 DTUs. The more DTUs, the more power, the more you pay. Easy. The problem is I have yet to find a database that scales linearly with all the resources, i.e. CPU, memory, storage, and networking. Yeah, doesn't work that way. So my recommendation, avoid the DTU model like the plague, because you are going to be constrained by something. And why not choose to have control? Because with the vCore model, it behaves not unlike your normal VMware or Hyper-V, whatever. You just assign it X number of CPUs and this much storage. You can't tweak the memory amount. That is automatically coupled to the CPU. And when it comes to storage, the dirty secret in everything that is spelled Azure SQL Database is that I/O is slow, unless you pay the big bucks. Hold that thought. So how do we poke around with these things? Well, we have the portal. That's where you usually go. So portal.azure.com, and then you have everything you need to work with the database. Now, up until fairly recently, you couldn't get inside of the database because the database, the service has yet to be connected to RBAC or role-based access control in Azure. You can't. I've heard rumors that they might be working on it, but that's not anything that I know. And that means that I can't create a user in the database in the portal. I need to do that through SQL Server Management Studio or the web interface that is available in the portal. So the portal just basically gets you so far. Then we have PowerShell. Oh boy, the things we can do with PowerShell these days. It is a phenomenal tool for shooting yourself in the foot with a huge grained and hugely powerful shell. The PowerShell is a fantastic tool. It has literally saved me thousands of hours of work, and especially the DBA tools, Commandlet suite, maintained by Chris Lemaire and Rob Sewell. I can't recommend that one enough. And of course, you can do things in ARM templates. Everything in Azure, I should say everything in the modern version of Azure, not the classic one, is based on ARM or Azure Resource Manager. Everything is code. Everything you do is code. So if you want to have a resource group or a virtual machine or a networking interface or a SQL server, well, it's a few lines of code. And using ARM templates, you can very, very quickly whip up enormous environments. And you just tear them down as well if you want to. So ARM templates, not the most fun to work with because they're JSON and they're quirky, but they're very, very powerful. So many ways of working with your database. Remember I told you about the different offerings, if you will. So let's start with the managed instance. The managed instance is designed for lift and shift scenarios where you can't just go for the Azure SQL database. It is designed for when you have specific compatibility requirements where you need to be able to set a compatibility level, where you need to do something in a simple recovery mode, where you need to have access to the agent or such. The problem with the managed instance, in my view, is it takes about a decade to create. When you have the first one, it's fairly quick to make another one. But due to the way it's designed underneath, it takes a long time to provision. And it is also pretty expensive. Now, what does expensive mean? Well, it depends. But just be aware that this offering comes with a fairly hefty price tag. The other one that we talk about is the single database, or the Azure SQL Database. This is more inclined towards cloud design applications where you don't have anything, you just create something in the cloud. The short time to market is phenomenal. Literally in 5 minutes, I can have a database server and I can have a database and good to go. So I can focus entirely on creating business value instead of mucking around with the database. There is minimal to zero hands-on requirements because this will automatically upgrade. It's what's known as evergreen. Then again, automation comes with some limitations, which means that you don't have explicit control over a few things, which may or may not have an impact. Then we have the elastic pool. The elastic pool is, instead of paying for, well, let's try it this way. Say you have 5 databases and you have varying load patterns on these databases. And instead of buying maximum power for them all, while most of the time they're just going to be idle, you put them in a pool and you add number of vCores and an amount of storage to the pool. And then it's up to the databases inside the pool to automatically decide among themselves when they need the power. So as long as you don't have overlapping load patterns, a pool is a fantastic way to really start to save money. I have a customer who is, they're writing a maintenance solution, and they used to run a lot of their clients or customers basically on-prem. We took them and moved them all into a few elastic pools. The customers are super happy because they get way more performance, and my customer, the developers, are super happy because they don't need to take care of a database server and a high availability copy as well. So it can be a super useful tool, but again, it's more for new and cloud designed applications. So what about the scalable aspect of things? Well, as I told you, scalability means I can grab more power when I need to. I remember vividly when I set up an Oracle, not a cloud, God no, an Oracle rack cluster back in the late 90s. And it took me a couple of days to get the server. It took me a few days to rack the whole thing and put the cablings in and make sure that the storage worked and so on and so forth. And then it was time to install the operating system, which was done by these round spinning disks called CD-ROMs. Yes, that was the day. Then when that was done, I configured the operating system, and then it was time to configure or install and configure Oracle. And then I created the cluster, and then I did my tests, and then I had to tear the whole thing down again. Now, if I needed more power, what do you think I needed to do? Well, I needed to get on the horn and buy a new server, wait weeks, yada, yada, yada. Here, I need more CPUs. Okay, grab the slider and pull. Voila. So this is super, super powerful. I can do it automatically or I can do it manually. It's all up to you. We're looking at pretty hefty numbers because in essence, everything is charged by the hour and the IOs are charged by the 1 million IOs. So this means that I can have anything from 1 to 80 CPUs and 44 to 440 gigs of RAM should I need to. Now, be advised though, the general purpose is what most people go for, but the GP is 500 to 7,500 IOPS per file, and this is the dirty secret of Azure. The storage performance is directly related to the size of the file in storage account. Yeah, you heard that right. So if I have a 200 megabyte table that I want to be super performant, yeah, you're going to need to provision a ginormous X number of gigabyte size of your storage account, because that's the only way to scale. And it also becomes rather expensive. So IO is potentially disastrously slow in the GP stuff. When it comes to the business critical, we have a set number of IOPS, so 1375 per vCore, and it's going to be way faster because it is based off SSDs instead. When it comes to the Azure SQL Database and the pool, we have all the same things. We have GP, we have business critical, and we have the hyperscale tier. The hyperscale tier is a completely different beast underneath. And people think that the hyperscale tier is only applicable if you have more than 100 terabytes. No, you probably want to look at the hyperscale tier way earlier, because the hyperscale tier does IO in a completely different way. And in many ways that I find that the hyperscale tier at the same price point is more performant. Just be aware that if you go hyperscale, you can't come back. You can switch between GP and business critical and from any of them to hyperscale, but you can't come back. So just keep that in mind. The pool does not have the hyperscale tier yet. This is the main ask for the hyperscale. And I personally hope that hyperscale will be the only way forward. In many ways, it kind of looks a bit like the big data clusters of SQL Server 2019. I told you about the pool. And here we have an example of one database with this kind of load pattern, not unlike reality at all. So it is spending most of the time in an idle state. Say that we add on another database, and it is not peaking at the same time. So we could get away with a pool in this case with a much lower number of CPUs than if we were needed to cater for both of these databases singularly. And as well, if you just add a number of other things, other databases, then we might actually get away with this, which is where the pool comes into its own. It is absolutely fantastic if you have new database or a new application that you're working with, and it is geared towards the new way of doing things in Azure. Then it can be a fantastic tool. So let's go back to the security aspects of things. There are a lot of tools built in that we can, or I should say we could just dream about, because in many ways we can extend all these things to the on-prem environment through Azure Arc, but that's a whole different story. But we have, for instance, the ATP, or the Azure Threat Protection. We have automatic SQL vulnerability and SQL injection security stuff. All this is built in, and we can turn this on. We're going to get a trial of ATP for SQL Server whenever we create a database server. That's going to be run for 30 days, and then it is going to cost you some extra money. This is a fantastic tool. You cannot believe just how much you get automatically when it comes to threat protection and security inside of Azure. And it's not strange. I mean, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of users of SQL Server, and there are only so many ways that you can attack a database. Basically, you're going to find patterns, and as soon as a pattern emerges, the underlying intelligence of Azure, if you will, is going to notice, and any mitigation done over here is automatically going to be applied over here, meaning that you're going to get the benefits of a huge environment automatically. Speaking of automation and benefits of huge environments, it should be able to take care of repetitive stuff like, yeah, performance tuning and so on. Well, hold that thought. But I remember, again, when I started out working in the late 90s, there was something called the HP Superdome. And Incidentally, there's still something called the HP Superdome. And all those things could have a phenomenal uptime because they could actually do patching on the fly. They could patch the kernel on the fly. The funny thing is, this is a picture from a session that Joe Sack of the SQL Server team did. This is basically how SQL Server does patching of the kernel in a running kernel. So this is how you can have SQL Server, Azure SQL Server evergreen. It's always updated. In very rare cases, it needs to reboot. Most of the time, it doesn't. And that kind of blows my mind, just not having to reboot a server and still get patched. That's kind of neat. We don't have this yet. I think it's been demoed for SQL Server vNext, and I'm pretty sure that it's going to get there. But at the moment, we don't have this outside of Azure. And while we're at it, high availability and backups. This is an old picture, because if you turn your back, you're going to build a new data center somewhere. You always have automatic high availability. If you're running business critical, everything is taken care for you. If you're running general GP, I forget what the B was, then you can just basically click, and voila, you have automatic high availability through kind of sort of always on availability groups. It's not exactly the same thing, but it works the same way. So you can have one or more replicas, and you can have one or more read replicas. This is fantastic if you're an outfit, especially here in Europe, and especially here in Sweden, I should say. Most of the customers that I work with don't have two geographically separate locations. So just having the ability to have one thing running in Amsterdam and another one running in Ireland, which is the secondary main data center in Europe, that's fantastic. You don't need to buy the land, you don't need to build, and you don't need to do the upkeep for your data centers. Azure does take care of backups for you if you wanted to. Standard and premium tier enjoys 35 days of backups, and you can restore to any point in time during this window. Full backups are done weekly, the differential every hour, and log backups roughly 5 to 10 minutes. And if you want to store backups longer, you have the Azure Recovery Services Vault. Do note that the long-term recovery or the long-term retention is not available for hyperscale just yet. There is a bit of an oops here, though. Be careful when it comes to these backups, because they are not technically designed to do a restore if a user comes and says, well, 20 days ago we did this. It works, but it's a bit messy. And you can always restore a database that you removed, as long as you don't take away the database server. Because if you do, all the backup history is gone. Ask me how I know. And then we have the elephant in the room. What about automatic tuning? Well, I'm here to tell you, as a DBA with 20 plus years of experience, that this is really good. Now, before everybody just unmutes and screams at me, there are so many aspects to tuning. And the first thing in people's minds is indexes. And yes, indexes can do a lot of good. Indexes can also be a horrible idea, but that's a different story. The thing is, just like with security, with so many users of Azure SQL Server, there are inevitably going to be patterns. And some query patterns are inherently bad. Some query patterns are inherently good, depending on your environment and your data model. And Azure SQL Server, behind the scenes, can see this, because Microsoft sees your queries. They can't read your data. That's not what it's about, but they can see the patterns, and they can recommend indexes. And we all remember the absolutely horrible index tuning wizard that the first time you run it said, I think you should set up these 5 indexes. And then you did, and then you run the index tuner advisory and said, yeah, you know, these 5 indexes, I think they need to go. And you're left with just what the? This doesn't work this way. This is actually useful. I'm just as blown away as you are. It is actually useful, and what's even better is that you can have it recommend things, but it's up to you to implement them, which in my view is the way to go, because at the end of the day, you're stuck holding the the tricky end of this if it doesn't work. So recommend, but don't automate this. Then again, if you're in a small shop that don't have a DBA, this is fantastic. It can't solve everything, but it is a nice step forward. It can also help you with forcing a last good plan. It's not a solution, but it can be a stopgap until you can get some competent person to come in and fix it. And of course, we have the automation stuff. Everything in Azure is code, and everything, just about everything is available for me. So I can have an Elastic job that does things on 10,000 databases. One job doing 10,000 databases. It's not at all unlike running PowerShell on-prem or using a database group, for instance. It works the same way. But here we can have triggers and reactions. Say, for instance, that an Azure SQL Server is running for 60% load over a number of minutes. We can have this react by sending an email, creating a new database server, removing a database server, anything you can think of, because everything in Azure is code. If you can create it in code, you can have it automated through this. That is pretty darn cool in my view. Which kind of leads us to the integration aspects of things. We very rarely are happy with just database or data in one place. We need to move it around, just like on-prem. The thing is, we have the Azure Data Factory, which is a fantastic tool for doing heavy lifting. It is a fantastically bad tool for doing small things often. Why? Because it will kill you financially. It is going to be prohibitively expensive to doing small things and doing them often. The money just blows you away. For that, I highly recommend Azure Functions for those things. But Azure Data Factory gives you so much automatic power doing, for instance, an upsert from a data source to a data sync, dead easy. It's literally done in minutes after you tore your head out over the horrible user interface with Azure Data Factory. But this is a SQL Server session. We're not going to be bashing Data Factory anymore, because that would be a session all on its own. We can integrate this with Power BI, easy. And as of relatively recently, we have the Azure Synapse Analytics, which is basically what you get if you take Data Lake, Spark, a kind of SQL database, the old Azure Data Warehouse, and a few other things, and put them in the blender. Out comes Azure Synapse Analytics. And all these can exchange data between them in a very, very simple and efficient manner. And of course, we have our old friend Azure Machine Learning as well, because again, we have the data in a substrate underneath, and all the applications can talk to the same data. Take the Synapse Analytics, the old data warehouse, for instance. Can you do that on-prem? Oh, sure you can. You can buy an APS or the parallel. I can't even remember what it's called these days. It's basically a half rack or a full rack of a Microsoft appliance. It is hideously expensive. It is super fast at specific workloads, but very few people that I know actually could buy one and have one in the data center, because you don't use it all the time. You generally use it for number crunching and heavy lifting for a short period of time. But now anyone can use it because you're paying by the hour, or even smaller increments if that might be the case. So if I have a specific workload that I know that is going to work well in a parallel environment, which the Azure Data Warehouse is, then I can whip one up inside of Azure Synapse Analytics, let it run for the number of minutes that I need to do my heavy lifting, and then shut it down again. I'm just going to be paying for the storage. So in that case, I have so much power on tap inside of Azure. So what can we learn? I've done a lot of both new projects inside of Azure. Those are the easiest because you're not going to be finding ways of where your on-prem stuff didn't quite work in Azure. And I've done a fair bit of migrations as well. I can conclude that most projects are going to require a bit of a redesign in your product. Surprisingly, people coming from Oracle have less problems than people coming from SQL Server, and that is because of SQL Server being what's known as a federated database. You have the master, the MSDB, and all that stuff, and then you have a lot of user databases. People have learned over the years that it's fine to separate data between databases. You can always query between them using cross-database scripting. Yeah, hold your horses there, boy, because you can't. In the Azure database, Azure SQL Database, you cannot do cross-database scripting. And this is where a lot of migration projects come to a screeching halt. Now, if that is not your problem, your next problem is inevitably going to be that there is no agent. Sucks to be you. And before someone says, well, there is an agent in the managed instance, yes, there is, but be very, very careful. Because you can't do all the things with the managed instance agent that you can do on-prem. Look it up. It's a chilling read. That kind of brings us to the different feature set. I'm saying differing feature set. I'm not saying better or worse. I'm saying different. Just like going from SQL Server 2012 to 2014 is going to give you different career plans due to the redesigned optimizer. Not necessarily better or worse, but different. It's the same thing here. You don't have the same features. It doesn't behave the same way. It doesn't work the same way. So do not come into a cloud project thinking that you know everything there is to know about how to do something with a database, because you don't. There are subtle differences. Then again, that's a challenge, and everybody likes a challenge, right? You're also going to have unexpected performance because I/O will suck. Yeah, I can't sugarcoat it any more than that. It will suck compared to what you can do on-prem. I can buy, well, just take my home machine, for instance. It has an NVMe drive. It is blazingly fast. It is literally running in circles around just about anything that I can put in the cloud. So it comes back to what I told you about tuning. If I can tune a query on-prem from 5 minutes to 5 seconds, my user are going to be happy. Yay, nice. But it's not going to change very much from a cost perspective because I already bought the SAN. I already bought the server. In Azure, that can be the difference between a P15 storage and a P10 storage. That's a lot of money. So you need to rethink how to apply your skills. And again, everything costs money. There is no such thing as a free lunch in Azure. Everything costs money. And one thing that I haven't mentioned when it comes to the unexpected performance is also that the price will differ, because there is no such thing as a standard edition SQL Server in Azure. The only way that you can run standard edition, which is what we predominantly do in Europe, is if you put it on a VM. Ta-da! Very, very, very quickly, I'm going to be showing you a few ways to get to the cloud. The best way, in my view, is the database migration assistant, because it is fairly clever. It is going to look at your database on-prem, and it's going to look at what you want to do with it and tell you that, yeah, no, you can't do this because this, and this. You need to fix it through this, and this. It is going to give you mitigation recommendations. You can treat the whole thing as a database project in Visual Studio if you want to. Of course, if you want to use data tools as well. But I find that the database migration assistant is, for the most part, the way to go. And moving a database up to the cloud is a two-pronged approach. One is the backpack, which means that you're moving the physical structure, and then you have the DAC pack where you move, or the other way around, I can't remember, where you move the actual data. Well, that's how you do it. And of course, you can do this on kind of a replication scheme, so you don't need to dump the whole thing in one go. Let's see, I can skip that one. So, in summary, you still have a job. Your job is not going to go away if you keep up. Then again, that's the same with every day. You cannot hold a DBA job or any tech job, well, generally in any job, if you're not constantly learning. But here, the rate of change is just, well, it's not even funny anymore. If you turn your back, or even worse, if you go on vacation, half of it's going to change. I did a Pluralsight course. I created a Pluralsight course on Power BI a few years back, and it was relevant for 2 weeks. Then Microsoft changed a lot of how Power BI works, but I'm not bitter. And the skill set is basically the same, but we're going to shift more towards the why and less about the how, because the how is fairly straightforward. There are only so many ways of creating a database and working with a database in Azure, but it's more about why. So if you can, start shifting towards requirements, start shifting towards the business application of whatever you're working with. And there are so many fantastically exciting opportunities, because when we start to connect things in the cloud, it's not unlike visualizing an Excel sheet in Power BI for the first time. You're going to find things that you had no idea was there. It's a fantastic jigsaw puzzle. You can spend an inordinate amount of time just figuring out how many cool ways you can connect things. And when you start to connect things and when you start to do automation, that's when the cloud really comes into its own. That is hard to say, into its own. Yeah, I'm getting old. So, in essence, the cloud can be an opportunity or it can be a threat. It's not coming anymore. It's already here, and it has been here for quite some time. It's waiting in the kitchen. You're basically faced with a choice. You can choose to stay entirely on-prem and rely on the skills you've already accumulated, or you can choose to embrace the cloud and everything that comes with it. And if you choose to embrace the cloud, I can promise you the ride of your life. Come to the cloud side. We don't have cookies. We have something much, much better, because we have the future. My name is Alexander, and I thank you so much for your time. So let's see if we have any questions, provided I can find the Teams window.
Thank you so much, Alexander. That was an amazing session. Well done.
Thank you.
Thanks again. If someone have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Anyone but Anders, because I know when he starts talking, we're going to be here for days.
You know, I just had to say something now, right?
I know you did. Thank you. Now you have. It's good to hear your voice again.
Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you very much, sir.
It is.
And as always, the number of questions is staggering. I'm just leaning into the wind. There is something about these online discussions. One day it can garner a ton of questions, and one day you're not going to get any questions. So it's hard to know, really.
Right. I think it seems like no one have any questions. So let's give them another 20 seconds.
I know
If
everyone wants to go to lunch.
Yes, absolutely. But that was an amazing session, Alexander. Right. And I like how you put it together. Thank you so much.
And definitely take a look at the links that I'm going to show you, and then hit me up if you want to have any more discussions about the setup and everything.
Okay.
And one of these days I will create a blog post. I've just been thinking about it for about a year.
Okay, perfect. Thanks again for your time. I think we all set. I'm gonna start. Can I share my screen?
Sure
now?
thing.
Perfect. Yep. Thank you everyone for attending our presentation. So I hope you guys have a great day or afternoon. Thanks one more time, Alexander, for your wonderful presentation. Feel free to share the meetup with your peers, friends, and also this, as the presentation is being recorded, I will keep you posted sometimes later. Thank you all. Have a good one. Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.